History is a story told in whispers and shouts. There are the shouts of great battles and revolutions. But then, there are the whispers. The quiet, often ignored stories of personal hatreds that fester and grow, poisoning families for generations, until they erupt into a private war so brutal, it becomes a national legend. The story you are about to hear begins not with the thunder of cannons, but with the squeal of a pig and an accusation of theft between neighbors. In the rugged, isolated mountains of Appalachia, along a winding river that served as a border between two states, lived two families. The Hatfields of West Virginia and the McCoys of Kentucky. For 30 years, they would wage a war against each other, a cycle of violence, ambush, and revenge that would leave dozens dead, draw the attention of governors and the Supreme Court, and create a story that would become a permanent part of American folklore. This is not just the story of a family feud. It is the story of how pride, honor, and a single, stolen pig ignited the bloodiest and most infamous family war in American history. Before we delve into this legendary conflict, we invite you to consider a question: what is more dangerous? The enemy you can see, or the system you are a part of? Leave your first impression in the comments below. Act 1: The River of Grudges. To understand the war that would consume two families for 3 decades, one must first understand the world that created the warriors who fought it. This was not a conflict that erupted overnight from a single incident, but rather the culmination of generations of tension, pride, and circumstance that had been building in the isolated hollows and ridges of Appalachian America since before the Civil War. Our story takes place in the Tug Fork Valley, a rugged, isolated pocket of the Appalachian Mountains that forms the natural border between West Virginia and Kentucky. This was, and still is, a land of breathtaking beauty and profound isolation, where steep, forest-covered mountains rise from the banks of the Tug Fork River like ancient fortresses, creating a landscape where communities were separated by ridges and hollows, and where family loyalty was not just important, it was the most powerful law of the land. The Tug Fork itself serves as more than just a geographical boundary between two states. It represents the heart of Appalachian culture in the post-Civil War era. The river winds through valleys that were carved by glaciers millions of years ago, creating a landscape of incredible natural beauty, but also one that was almost completely cut off from the rapidly industrializing world of late 19th century America. Travel was difficult, communication was sporadic, and the federal government seemed as distant as a foreign country to the families who had carved their lives out of this unforgiving wilderness. In the years following the American Civil War, this region had become a world unto itself, governed by customs and codes that had been brought from Scotland and Ireland generations earlier and had evolved in isolation to fit the harsh realities of frontier life. The people here were fiercely independent, descended from Scots-Irish settlers who had been pushing west since the colonial period, seeking land and freedom from the restrictions of more settled areas. These were a proud, tough people, defined by their clan-like family structures that extended far beyond immediate blood relations to include cousins, in-laws, and neighbors who had proven their loyalty over time. They were characterized by their deep suspicion of outsiders, whether those outsiders were government officials, traveling merchants, or families from the next valley over. Most importantly, they lived by a strict, unwritten code of honor that had its roots in the warrior cultures of Celtic Europe but had been adapted to the realities of American frontier life. In the Tug Fork Valley, a man's reputation was his most valuable possession, more important than land, livestock, or money. That reputation was built on his ability to provide for his family, to protect them from harm, and to demand respect from his neighbors. Any insult to that reputation, any suggestion that a man could not or would not defend his family's honor, had to be met with immediate and decisive retribution. To fail to respond to such an insult was to invite further attacks and to lose the respect that was essential for survival in such an isolated and dangerous environment. This code of honor was not merely a cultural preference. but a practical necessity in a region where formal law enforcement was virtually non-existent and where disputes had to be settled between families and clans rather than in courtrooms. The nearest sheriff might be days away by horseback, and even if he could be reached, he might not have the authority or the ability to enforce his decisions in such a remote area. Justice, therefore, was a matter of personal responsibility, and the threat of violent retaliation was often the only thing that prevented stronger families from taking advantage of weaker ones. It was in this environment that two of the most powerful and influential families in the Tug Fork Valley had established themselves as leaders of their respective communities. These were not just ordinary farming families, but clans that had built networks of kinship, employment, and mutual obligation that extended throughout their regions and gave them influence that was comparable to that of feudal lords in medieval Europe. At the head of the West Virginia side of this divided valley was William Anderson Hatfield, known to everyone in the region as Devil Anse. The nickname itself tells us something important about how he was viewed by his neighbors. He was a man to be feared and respected, someone who was capable of both great generosity and terrible violence, depending on how he was treated and whether his family's interests were threatened. Devil Anse Hatfield was born on September 9, 1839, in what is now Mingo County, West Virginia, but which was then part of Logan County. He was the son of Ephraim Hatfield and Nancy Vance, and he grew up in a family that was already well established in the region and that had a reputation for toughness and independence that was notable even by Appalachian standards. Physical descriptions of Devil Anse from those who knew him paint a picture of a man who was naturally imposing and charismatic. He stood over 6 feet tall, which was unusual for men of his era, and he had dark hair, dark eyes, and a dark complexion that gave him an intimidating appearance. For most of his adult life, he wore a full, dark beard that added to his formidable presence, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never backed down from a fight and who expected others to show him the deference that his reputation demanded. But Devil Anse was far more than just a physically intimidating mountain man. He was also a shrewd businessman and a natural leader who had built one of the most successful timber operations in the region. By the 1870s, his logging business employed dozens of men, including members of both the Hatfield and McCoy families, and his sawmills were processing thousands of board feet of lumber that was shipped down the Big Sandy River to markets in Ohio and Pennsylvania. The timber business had made Devil Anse one of the wealthiest men in the Tug Fork Valley, but more importantly, it had given him the kind of economic power that translated directly into political and social influence. The men who worked for him depended on him for their livelihoods, and their family's welfare was directly tied to his success. This created a network of loyalty and obligation that extended far beyond his immediate family and that gave him the ability to command support when conflicts arose with neighboring families or outside authorities. Devil Anse had married Levice Chafin in 1861, shortly before the outbreak of the Civil War, and together they had built a family that would become legendary in the region. Levice was a strong woman who had adapted to the demands of frontier life and who had proven herself capable of managing the household and the business affairs when her husband was away. She gave birth to 13 children, creating a clan that would dominate West Virginia politics and business for generations. The Hatfield children were raised with a clear understanding of their place in the regional hierarchy and with a deep sense of loyalty to their family and its interests. They were taught to be proud of their name and their accomplishments, but they were also taught that with privilege came responsibility, and that they had an obligation to protect and advance their family's position in the community. The sons, in particular, were groomed to carry on the family tradition of leadership and business success. They were taught to be skilled with weapons, to be fearless in confrontations, and to understand that their individual actions reflected on the entire family's reputation. They were also taught the importance of loyalty, both to their immediate family and to the extended network of allies and employees who depended on the Hatfield organization for their prosperity and protection. On the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork River lived the family that would become the Hatfields' most bitter and dangerous enemies. The McCoy clan was led by Randolph McCoy, who was known throughout the region as Old Randell or Old Randall. While he was not as wealthy or as politically powerful as Devil Anse Hatfield, Randolph McCoy was equally proud and equally unwilling to suffer any slight to his family's honor. Randolph McCoy was born on October 30th, 1825, making him almost 14 years older than Devil Anse Hatfield. He was the fourth of 13 children born to Daniel McCoy and Margaret Taylor McCoy, and he had grown up in a family that was well respected in Pike County but that had never achieved the kind of wealth and influence that the Hatfields had built on the West Virginia side of the river. Unlike Devil Anse, who had built his fortune through timber and business ventures, Randolph McCoy was primarily a farmer who had acquired a 300-acre farm on Blackberry Fork of Pond Creek in Pike County. The farm provided a decent living for his large family, but it did not generate the kind of wealth that would have given him significant political influence or the ability to command the loyalty of large numbers of men outside his immediate kinship network. However, what Randolph McCoy lacked in wealth and political connections, he made up for in personal integrity and stubborn determination. He was known throughout Pike County as a man who could be trusted to keep his word, who would stand by his friends in times of trouble, and who would never compromise his principles for material gain. These qualities had earned him the respect of his neighbors and had established his family as one of the moral leaders of the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork Valley. Randolph McCoy had married his first cousin, Sarah McCoy, on December 9, 1849, in a marriage that was typical of the close-knit kinship networks that characterized Appalachian society. Sarah was the daughter of Samuel McCoy and Elizabeth Davis, and her marriage to Randolph strengthened the ties between different branches of the McCoy family while also ensuring that property and influence would remain within the clan. Together, Randolph and Sarah McCoy raised 16 children, creating a family that was even larger than the Hatfield clan and that represented a significant portion of the population of their part of Pike County. The McCoy children were raised with the same emphasis on family loyalty and personal honor that characterized their Hatfield counterparts, but they were also taught the importance of hard work, thrift, and moral rectitude that reflected their father's values and their family's more modest circumstances. The McCoy family's economic situation was more precarious than that of the Hatfields, as they depended primarily on agriculture and small-scale livestock raising rather than on the kind of large-scale business operations that had made Devil Anse wealthy. This economic vulnerability made them more dependent on their reputation for honesty and reliability, as their ability to borrow money, find work, and maintain their position in the community depended on their neighbors' trust and respect. The seeds of the conflict between these two powerful families had been planted during the Civil War, when the political and cultural divisions that had been simmering in American society for decades finally erupted into open warfare. The war had a particularly devastating impact on the border regions of Appalachia, where families and communities were divided in their loyalties and where the conflict took on the characteristics of a civil war within a civil war. The majority of both the Hatfield and McCoy families had supported the Confederate cause during the war, reflecting both their Southern cultural heritage and their deep suspicion of the federal government that was characteristic of Appalachian political culture. However, the war had created divisions within both families that would have long-lasting consequences for their relationship with each other and with the outside world. Devil Anse Hatfield had served with distinction in the Confederate Army, initially with an irregular unit called the Logan Wildcats and later with the regular Virginia Infantry. The Logan Wildcats were a locally organized militia unit that had been formed to defend the Tug Fork Valley against Union raiders, but they had also served as a kind of vigilante organization that enforced Confederate loyalty and dealt harshly with anyone suspected of Union sympathies. Hatfield's military service had enhanced his reputation for leadership and courage, and his connections with other Confederate veterans had given him political influence that extended beyond his immediate region. He had proven himself capable of leading men in combat, and his willingness to use violence to achieve his objectives had been validated by his war service and had become an accepted part of his leadership style. The McCoy family's relationship with the Civil War was more complicated and more tragic. While the majority of the family supported the Confederacy, one member had made a decision that would have fatal consequences for himself and lasting implications for the entire family. Asa Harmon McCoy, Randolph's brother, had decided to enlist in the Union Army, specifically with the Pike County Home Guard, a unit that was composed primarily of local men who had remained loyal to the federal government. Asa Harmon's decision to fight for the Union was viewed as treason by many of his neighbors, and even by some members of his own family. In the highly charged atmosphere of wartime Appalachia, where political loyalties were often matters of life and death, his choice to serve with the Union forces made him a target for Confederate sympathizers who saw him as a traitor to his region and his heritage. When Asa Harmon McCoy returned home after his discharge in 1864, he found himself in a precarious and dangerous situation. He was a marked man in a region where Confederate sympathizers controlled most of the local militia units and where vigilante justice was common. He attempted to protect himself by hiding in a cave near his family's home, but his efforts to avoid confrontation proved futile. On January 7, 1865, just days before the end of the Civil War, Asa Harmon McCoy was murdered by a group of Confederate irregulars who had tracked him to his hiding place. While the murder was never officially solved, it was widely believed that the killing had been carried out by members of the Logan Wildcats, the same unit in which Devil Anse Hatfield had served. The prime suspect in Asa Harmon's murder was Jim Vance, Devil Anse Hatfield's uncle, who was known throughout the region as one of the most violent and uncompromising members of the Logan Wildcats. Vance was a man who believed that the war against the Union should continue even after the formal end of hostilities, and he saw the elimination of Union sympathizers as both a patriotic duty and a practical necessity for maintaining Confederate control over the region. While Devil Anse Hatfield was not directly implicated in his uncle's actions, and may not have been present during the actual murder, the McCoy family held the entire Hatfield clan responsible for the death of their family member. The fact that the Hatfields did not denounce the murder or turn in the perpetrators was seen as evidence of their complicity, and it created a reservoir of resentment that would poison relationships between the families for decades. The murder of Asa Harmon McCoy represented more than just a single act of violence. It was a symbol of the breakdown of law and order that had characterized the Tug Fork Valley during and after the Civil War. The war had legitimized violence as a means of settling political disputes, and it had created a culture in which armed force was often the only way to resolve conflicts between individuals and families. For the McCoy family, Asa Harmon's death was both a personal tragedy and a public humiliation. They had been unable to protect one of their own from their enemies, and they had been powerless to obtain justice through official channels. This failure undermined their reputation and their position in the community, creating a sense of grievance that would drive their actions in the years that followed. For more than a decade after the end of the Civil War, the tensions between the Hatfield and McCoy families remained largely beneath the surface. Both families were focused on rebuilding their lives and their economic positions in the difficult years of Reconstruction, and neither side was eager to initiate an open conflict that might attract unwanted attention from federal authorities or state governments. However, the underlying grievances and resentments continued to fester, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and hostility that affected every interaction between members of the two families. Business dealings were conducted with caution and skepticism, social relationships were strained by political differences, and both sides remained constantly alert for signs of disrespect or aggression from the other. The spark that would finally ignite this accumulated resentment into open warfare came in 1878, over a dispute that seemed almost absurdly trivial but that touched on the fundamental issues of property rights, family honor, and personal integrity that were at the heart of Appalachian culture. The incident began when Randolph McCoy publicly accused Floyd Hatfield, a cousin of Devil Aunts, of stealing one of his pigs. In a community where livestock represented a significant portion of a family's wealth and where the ability to protect one's property was a measure of personal competence, this was far more than a simple accusation of theft. It was a challenge to the McCoy family's reputation and a suggestion that they were either unable or unwilling to protect what belonged to them. The pig in question was valuable not just for its monetary worth, but for what it represented in terms of family prestige and economic security. In a region where cash was scarce and where families often lived on the edge of subsistence, the loss of even a single animal could mean the difference between having enough food for the winter and facing real hardship. The accusation that it had been stolen was therefore both a practical matter and a question of family honor. Floyd Hatfield's alleged theft of the pig was also significant because it represented a violation of the informal codes of conduct that governed relationships between families in the Tug Fork Valley. Even if the Hatfield and McCoy families were not friendly, they were expected to respect each other's property rights and to conduct their disputes according to accepted rules of behavior. The accusation of theft suggested that the Hatfields were not willing to abide by these rules and were prepared to use their superior economic and political power to take advantage of their neighbors. The case was brought before the local justice of the peace, Anderson Preacher Aunts Hatfield, who was a cousin of Devil Aunts but who was also known for his fairness and his commitment to religious principles. The choice of Anderson Hatfield as the judge reflected the limited options available for resolving disputes in such an isolated region, but it also created an obvious conflict of interest that would affect how the McCoys viewed the legitimacy of any decision he might make. To ensure some semblance of fairness in a community that was dominated by extended family networks, the jury was carefully composed of 6 Hatfields and 6 McCoys, representing an attempt to balance the competing interests and loyalties that would influence the verdict. This arrangement reflected the recognition that in such a close-knit community, it was impossible to find completely neutral parties, and that justice would have to depend on the ability of the two sides to monitor each other and prevent obvious bias. The key witness in the trial was Bill Statton, a man who was related to both families through the complex web of intermarriage that characterized Appalachian kinship networks. Statton's testimony would be crucial because he claimed to have witnessed the events surrounding the disputed ownership of the pig, and his word would likely determine whether Floyd Hatfield was found guilty or innocent of the theft charges. Bill Statton's position in the case was particularly delicate because his family relationships created conflicting loyalties that made it almost impossible for him to testify without offending one side or the other. He was related to the McCoys through blood, but he was also connected to the Hatfields through marriage, and his economic interests were tied to both families in ways that created pressure to support whichever side was more likely to benefit his own family's position. When Statton took the stand, he testified in favor of Floyd Hatfield, stating that in his opinion, the pig in question had legitimately belonged to the Hatfield family rather than to the McCoys. His testimony was delivered in a straightforward manner that suggested confidence in his account of the events, but the McCoys were immediately suspicious of his motives and his reliability as a witness. Based on Statton's testimony and the other evidence presented during the trial, the jury ruled that the pig belonged to Floyd Hatfield and that he was innocent of the theft charges brought by Randolph McCoy. The verdict was announced in the formal language of frontier justice, but its implications were clear. The McCoys had publicly accused a member of the Hatfield family of theft, and they had been unable to prove their case in a court of law. For the McCoy family, the verdict was far more than a simple legal defeat. It was a public humiliation that suggested they were either lying about the theft or were incompetent in their efforts to protect their property. The fact that the key witness against them had been someone who was related to their own family made the defeat even more bitter, as it suggested that they could not even count on the loyalty of their own kinsmen when their interests conflicted with those of the more powerful Hatfield clan. The McCoys were convinced that Bill Statton had committed perjury on the witness stand, either because he had been bribed or intimidated by the Hatfields, or because he believed that supporting the more powerful family would benefit his own interests in the long run. They were equally convinced that the entire trial had been a sham, designed to give legal legitimacy to what was essentially theft by the politically connected Hatfield family. The pig trial represented the point of no return in the relationship between the Hatfield and McCoy families. What had previously been a matter of private resentment and suspicion had now become a public dispute that had been resolved in favor of the Hatfields and against the McCoys. The legal victory had enhanced the Hatfields' reputation for power and influence, while the defeat had damaged the McCoys' standing in the community and had created a sense of grievance that demanded redress. A few months after the trial, the simmering tensions erupted into the first act of violence in what would become known as the Hatfield-McCoy feud. Two of Randolph McCoy's nephews, Paris and Sam McCoy, confronted Bill Stanton in a remote area near the Kentucky-West Virginia border. The confrontation began as an argument about Stanton's testimony during the pig trial, but it quickly escalated into a physical altercation that ended when Stanton was shot and killed. The killing of Bill Stanton was officially ruled to be self-defense after Paris and Sam McCoy claimed that Stanton had drawn a weapon first and had threatened their lives. However, the Hatfield family saw the killing as a clear act of retaliation for Stanton's testimony during the pig trial, and they viewed it as evidence that the McCoys were prepared to use violence to settle their grievances rather than accepting the decisions of legally constituted authorities. The death of Bill Stanton marked the beginning of a cycle of violence that would consume both families for the next 30 years. Each act of violence would be seen by the opposing side as justification for retaliation, and each retaliation would create new grievances that would require further response. The informal codes of honor that governed Appalachian society demanded that insults be answered and that family members be avenged, creating a spiral of escalating violence that would prove almost impossible to stop once it had begun. In the immediate aftermath of Stanton's death, both families attempted to maintain an uneasy peace while they assessed their positions and planned their next moves. The Hatfields were confident in their superior economic and political resources, but they were also aware that the McCoys had demonstrated their willingness to resort to violence to defend their interests. The McCoys, for their part, had proven that they would not accept humiliation passively, but they also understood that they were facing an enemy with greater resources and more powerful connections. What followed was a period of deceptive calm that lasted for nearly 2 years, during which both families continued their normal activities while remaining constantly alert for signs of renewed hostility from the other side. Business relationships continued, but with increased caution and suspicion. Social interactions became more formal and less frequent, and both families began to prepare for the possibility that the conflict might escalate beyond isolated acts of violence to something approaching open warfare. The tensions were heightened by a new and more personal drama that would add the element of romantic betrayal to the already volatile mixture of family pride, economic competition, and political rivalry. The story of forbidden love that was about to unfold would transform a dispute over property and honor into a deeply personal conflict that would make reconciliation between the families almost impossible. At a local election day gathering in 1880, an event that served as both a political meeting and a social occasion for families throughout the Tug Fork Valley, two young people would meet and fall in love, creating a romance that would become legendary in Appalachian folklore, but that would also serve as another spark to ignite the growing flames of family hatred. Johnson Johnce Hatfield was Devil Ance's eldest son, a handsome and charismatic young man who had inherited his father's confidence and natural leadership abilities, but who lacked his father's discipline and business acumen. At 18 years old, Johnce was known throughout the region as a charmer and a ladies' man, someone who had a reputation for romantic conquests but who had never formed any lasting attachments that might interfere with his freedom to pursue new adventures. Rosanna McCoy was Randolph McCoy's daughter, a beautiful young woman who was 21 years old and who was considered one of the most attractive and intelligent young women in Pike County. She had dark hair and dark eyes that reflected both her intelligence and her passionate nature, and she had been raised with the same emphasis on family honor and personal integrity that characterized all members of the McCoy clan. The meeting between John Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy at the Election Day gathering was a classic example of the star-crossed lovers theme that has appeared in literature and folklore throughout history. They were immediately attracted to each other, but their families' bitter rivalry made any relationship between them not just difficult, but dangerous for both sides. Despite the obvious obstacles, the attraction between John and Rosanna proved to be stronger than their fear of family disapproval. Within weeks of their first meeting, they had begun a secret romance that involved clandestine meetings in remote locations where they could avoid detection by members of either family. The secrecy added excitement to their relationship, but it also created enormous stress as they struggled to balance their love for each other with their loyalty to their families. The romance reached a crisis point when Rosanna made the decision to abandon her family and go to live with the Hatfields, a choice that represented the ultimate betrayal of family loyalty in Appalachian culture. By choosing her lover over her family, she was violating one of the most fundamental principles of mountain society and was ensuring that she would be viewed as a traitor by her own relatives. Rosanna's decision to live with the Hatfields created a sensation throughout the Tug Fork Valley, as families and neighbors struggled to understand how a McCoy daughter could have betrayed her own family for the sake of a romantic relationship with their enemies. The scandal provided fodder for gossip and speculation that would continue for years, and it created additional tensions between the families that went beyond their original disputes over property and honor. However, the romance that might have served to unite the two families instead drove them further apart. Neither Devalance Hatfield nor Randolph McCoy was willing to sanction a marriage between their children, as such a union would have required them to acknowledge the legitimacy of their enemies and to subordinate their family pride to their children's romantic preferences. The pressure from both families eventually proved to be too much for the young couple to withstand. Rosanna, torn between her love for Johnson and her loyalty to her family, eventually returned to the McCoys, but not before she had become pregnant with John's child. Her return to the McCoy household was not a reconciliation, but rather a retreat by someone who had been defeated by circumstances beyond her control. The failed romance between Johnson and Rosanna had added another layer of personal bitterness to the already existing grievances between the Hatfield and McCoy families. For the McCoys, their daughter's betrayal was a source of shame that reflected poorly on their ability to control their own family members. For the Hatfields, the episode was evidence of their power to attract even their enemies' children, but it also created complications that they would have preferred to avoid. Most importantly, the romance had demonstrated that the conflict between the families had reached a level of intensity that made normal social relationships almost impossible. If young people from the two families could not even fall in love without creating a scandal that threatened to destroy both sides, then there was little hope that the broader conflicts could be resolved through negotiation or compromise. The stage was now set for the escalation of violence that would transform the Hatfield-McCoy dispute from a series of isolated incidents into a full-scale family war. All of the elements that would drive the conflict were now in place: economic rivalry, political differences, personal grievances, romantic betrayal, and most importantly, a culture of honor that demanded violent retaliation for any insult or injury. The Election Day gathering of 1882 would provide the spark that would ignite this volatile mixture into an explosion of violence that would consume both families and would capture the attention of the entire nation. The events of that day would transform local feuding families into symbols of American violence and would create a legend that would endure long after the participants themselves had been forgotten. Act 2: The Killing Years. The transformation of the Hatfield-McCoy dispute from a simmering feud into open warfare began on August 7, 1882, at another Election Day gathering in Pike County, Kentucky. These political events were the social highlight of the year for most families in the Tug Fork Valley, combining democratic participation with opportunities for trading, socializing, and, unfortunately, settling old scores that had been accumulating throughout the year. Election day gatherings in Appalachian Kentucky were raucous, chaotic events that brought together hundreds of people from throughout the county for a day of political speeches, horse trading, drinking, and celebration. The combination of politics, alcohol, and old grudges created a volatile atmosphere where violence was always a possibility. But the democratic traditions of the region demanded that these events continue despite the obvious dangers they presented. The 1882 election was particularly significant because it involved heated contests for several local offices, including positions that would have direct influence over law enforcement and the administration of justice in Pike County. The outcome of these elections would determine which families and political factions would control the machinery of government for the next several years, making the stakes much higher than a simple democratic exercise. Both the Hatfield and McCoy families had strong interests in the election results, as political control would affect their ability to protect their business interests, settle legal disputes in their favor, and maintain their positions as leading families in their respective communities. The fact that members of both families would be present at the same event, with alcohol flowing freely and political tensions running high, created a situation where conflict was almost inevitable. The violence began as it often did in such circumstances, with a seemingly minor disagreement that escalated rapidly beyond anyone's ability to control it. Three of Randolph McCoy's sons, Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., who was known as Bud, became involved in a heated political argument with Ellison Hatfield, Devil Ance's brother and one of the most respected members of the Hatfield clan. Ellison Hatfield was a formidable figure in his own right, a man who had served with distinction in the Confederate Army and who had earned a reputation for both courage and violent temper. He was also one of Devil Ance's most trusted advisors and was considered essential to the Hatfield family's political and business operations. Any attack on Ellison would be viewed by the Hatfields as an attack on their family's honor and their position in the community. The argument between the McCoy brothers and Ellison Hatfield began over political issues but quickly became personal as old grievances and family resentments surfaced in the heated atmosphere of the election gathering. Witnesses later reported that both sides had been drinking heavily and that the level of hostility had been escalating throughout the day as supporters of both families gathered around to watch the confrontation. What happened next would be disputed by witnesses for years afterward, but the essential facts were clear enough to establish the sequence of events that led to tragedy. The verbal argument escalated into a physical confrontation when someone, accounts differ about who threw the first punch, initiated a brawl that quickly involved not just the principals but their supporters as well. The fight was brutal even by the standards of frontier violence. Ellison Hatfield, despite being outnumbered 3-1, proved to be a formidable opponent who gave as good as he got during the initial stages of the brawl. However, the McCoy brothers were younger and more agile, and they were fighting with the desperate intensity of men who understood that their family's reputation depended on their ability to hold their own against their enemies. As the fight continued, weapons began to appear. Tolbert McCoy drew a knife and began stabbing Ellison Hatfield repeatedly, inflicting wounds that would prove to be mortal. According to witness testimony, Ellison was stabbed 26 times during the course of the fight, suffering injuries to his torso, arms, and legs that left him covered in blood and barely conscious. But the McCoy brothers were not finished with their assault on the Hatfield patriarch. As Ellison lay wounded and helpless on the ground, Bud McCoy drew a pistol and shot him in the back, adding a gunshot wound to the multiple stab wounds that were already threatening his life. The shooting was witnessed by dozens of people, creating evidence that would later be used to justify the Hatfields' demands for revenge. The attack on Ellison Hatfield represented more than just a violent assault during a political argument. It was a direct challenge to the Hatfield family's position as the dominant power in the Tug Fork Valley, and it was an insult to their honor that could not be ignored or forgiven. The fact that the attack had been carried out by three McCoy brothers acting together suggested that it had been planned or coordinated, rather than being a spontaneous act of violence during a heated argument. The news of Ellison's injuries spread rapidly throughout the election gathering, creating panic among the McCoy supporters who understood that they were now in immediate danger of retaliation from the Hatfield family and their allies. Many families began leaving the gathering immediately, seeking to distance themselves from what was clearly going to become a violent confrontation between the two most powerful clans in the region. The three McCoy brothers, realizing the magnitude of what they had done and the certainty of violent revenge from the Hatfields, attempted to flee the scene and make their way back to the relative safety of their family's stronghold on the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork. However, their escape was hampered by the large crowds of people who were also trying to leave the gathering, and they were unable to get far before they were overtaken by their pursuers. Devalance Hatfield's response to the attack on his brother was swift, decisive, and ruthless. Upon hearing of Ellison's injuries, he immediately organized a posse of family members and loyal supporters, arming them with rifles and pistols and setting out in pursuit of the McCoy brothers. His actions were later justified as those of a lawman rather than a vigilante, as he had himself deputized as a constable and had therefore given his posse legal authority to make arrests. However, Devalance's pursuit of the McCoy brothers was motivated by something far more personal than law enforcement. His brother was dying from his wounds, and the code of honor that governed Appalachian society demanded immediate and proportionate revenge for such an attack. The fact that he had legal authority for his actions simply provided a convenient justification for what was essentially a family vendetta. The pursuit of the McCoy brothers was relentless and methodical, utilizing the tracking skills and local knowledge that Devalance and his men had developed during their years as hunters and soldiers. They followed the fugitives through the dense forests and steep ravines of the Kentucky mountains, gradually closing the distance and cutting off potential escape routes until the McCoys were cornered in a remote area where they could neither advance nor retreat. The capture of the three McCoy brothers took place after several hours of pursuit, during which time Devalance had received word that his brother's condition was deteriorating and that he was not expected to survive his wounds. This news transformed what might have been a law enforcement operation into a death sentence, as Devalance announced to his prisoners that their fate would depend entirely on whether Ellison Hatfield lived or died. This announcement represented a fundamental rejection of the legal system and a return to the kind of personal justice that had characterized frontier society before the establishment of formal courts and law enforcement agencies. Devalance was declaring that he, not the courts, would determine the appropriate punishment for the attack on his brother, and that this punishment would be based on the ancient principle of an eye for an eye rather than on any legal standards of evidence or due process. The three McCoy brothers were held prisoner in a crude jail in West Virginia while Devalance and his followers waited to see whether Ellison would recover from his wounds. During this period, the prisoners were allowed to receive visits from family members, including their mother Sarah McCoy, who made desperate appeals for mercy and attempted to negotiate some kind of arrangement that would spare her sons' lives. Sarah McCoy's pleas to Devalance were heartbreaking in their desperation and their recognition of the hopelessness of her son's situation. She offered to pay compensation for Ellison's injuries, to provide guarantees that her family would not seek revenge if her sons were spared, and to do anything else that might satisfy the Hatfields' demands for justice. However, her appeals fell on deaf ears, as Devalance had already made his decision about what would happen if his brother died. On August 9, 1882, 2 days after the Election Day brawl, Ellison Hatfield succumbed to his injuries and died, sealing the fate of the three McCoy brothers who had attacked him. Devalance's response was immediate and final. The McCoy brothers would be executed in retaliation for Ellison's death, and this execution would be carried out according to Hatfield justice rather than through any legal proceedings. The execution of the three McCoy brothers was carried out with a ritual formality that reflected both the seriousness of their crime and the Hatfields' determination to send a clear message about the consequences of attacking their family. Devalance and his men transported the prisoners across the Tug Fork River into Kentucky, symbolically returning them to their home territory before carrying out the death sentence. At a remote location near the Kentucky-West Virginia border, the three McCoy brothers were tied to pawpaw bushes, small trees that were common in the Appalachian forests and that would serve as makeshift execution posts. The choice of pawpaw bushes was both practical and symbolic, as these trees were strong enough to support the weight of the prisoners but were also associated in local folklore with death and misfortune. The execution itself was carried out by multiple members of the Hatfield party, ensuring that responsibility for the killings would be shared among the entire group rather than falling on any single individual. This collective approach to the execution reflected the clan-based nature of Appalachian justice and emphasized that the killings were authorized by the entire Hatfield family rather than being the actions of individual vigilantes. According to witnesses, more than 50 shots were fired at the three McCoy brothers, ensuring that each man died instantly and that there would be no possibility of survival or rescue. The excessive number of shots fired was intended to demonstrate the intensity of the Hatfields' anger and their determination to make an example that would discourage any future attacks on their family members. The Pawpaw Bush executions marked the point of no return in the Hatfield-McCoy feud, transforming what had been a series of isolated incidents into a blood feud that would consume both families for the next decade. The killings were not just acts of revenge, but declarations of war that announced the Hatfields' intention to use whatever violence was necessary to protect their interests and maintain their position as the dominant power in the Tug Fork Valley. The executions also represented a fundamental challenge to the authority of the state governments of both Kentucky and West Virginia, as Devalance had essentially declared that his family's justice was superior to that provided by legally constituted courts and law enforcement agencies. This challenge to state authority would eventually draw the attention of political leaders who could not allow such defiance to go unpunished, but in the immediate aftermath of the killings, the Hatfields appeared to have successfully established their dominance over their enemies. The news of the Pawpaw Bush execution spread rapidly throughout Appalachia and beyond, creating a sensation in newspapers and establishing the Hatfield-McCoy feud as a national story that captured the public imagination. The killings were reported in lurid detail by journalists who were fascinated by what they saw as a throwback to frontier violence in an era when most of America was becoming increasingly civilized and law-abiding. However, the executions also created new enemies for the Hatfield family, as they demonstrated that Devalance was prepared to use lethal force to settle disputes and was not constrained by legal or moral considerations that might limit other family leaders. The killings established a precedent for violence that would make peaceful resolution of future conflicts almost impossible and would ensure that every subsequent disagreement between the families would carry the potential for deadly consequences. The McCoy family's response to the executions of Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud was initially muted by shock and fear, as Randolph McCoy and his surviving family members struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their loss and to develop a strategy for dealing with enemies who had demonstrated their willingness to kill without hesitation or remorse. The loss of three adult sons represented not just a personal tragedy for the family, but also a significant reduction in their ability to defend themselves against future attacks. However, the McCoys were not prepared to accept their defeat passively or to allow the deaths of their family members to go unavenged. Randolph McCoy began reaching out to relatives and political allies throughout Pike County, seeking support for a campaign to bring the Hatfield killers to justice through legal means rather than through the kind of vigilante violence that had characterized the conflict thus far. The key figure in this effort was Perry Klein, a McCoy relative who had become a successful lawyer and who had developed political connections that extended beyond the immediate region to the state capital in Frankfort. Klein was a shrewd political operator who understood that the Hatfield-McCoy feud could be used to advance his own career while also serving the McCoy family's desire for revenge. Kline's strategy was based on the recognition that the Hatfield executions had violated state law and had challenged the authority of the Kentucky state government in ways that could not be ignored by political leaders who were concerned about maintaining order and the rule of law. He began lobbying state officials to take action against the Hatfields, arguing that their crimes represented not just attacks on individual families, but threats to the stability and authority of the state government itself. The political campaign orchestrated by Perry Kline eventually succeeded in persuading Kentucky Governor Luke P. Blackburn to offer rewards for the capture of Devil Anse Hatfield and the other men who had participated in the Pawpaw Bush executions. The rewards were substantial by the standards of the time, reflecting both the seriousness of the crimes and the state government's determination to demonstrate that it would not tolerate such challenges to its authority. The governor's action transformed the Hatfield-McCoy feud from a local dispute into an interstate conflict, as West Virginia officials were called upon to cooperate in the arrest and extradition of men who were prominent citizens of their state. This development created political complications that extended far beyond the Tug Fork Valley and that would eventually involve governors, legislatures, and even the United States Supreme Court in the resolution of what had begun as a dispute over a stolen pig. The Kentucky government's decision to pursue the Hatfields through legal channels represented a significant escalation in the conflict, but it also created opportunities for the Hatfield family to use their political connections and financial resources to defend themselves against what they portrayed as persecution by hostile outside forces. Devil Anse and his supporters began organizing their own political campaign, seeking to portray themselves as victims of Kentucky political manipulation rather than as criminals who deserved punishment for their actions. The legal and political maneuvering that followed the Pawpaw Bush executions continued for several years, creating a complex web of indictments, extradition requests, and interstate negotiations that kept the feud in the public eye and prevented either side from achieving a decisive victory. During this period, both families continued to prepare for the possibility of renewed violence while also pursuing their objectives through legal and political means. The hiring of Bad Frank Phillips as a bounty hunter and special deputy by the Kentucky authorities represented a new and more dangerous phase in the conflict, as Phillips was known throughout the region as a man who was willing to use whatever violence was necessary to capture his targets. Phillips had a reputation for ruthlessness and efficiency that made him an ideal choice for pursuing men like the Hatfields, who were well-armed and who had demonstrated their willingness to fight rather than surrender to legal authorities. Phillips assembled a posse of experienced gunmen and manhunters who were motivated by the substantial rewards offered by the Kentucky government and who shared his willingness to use deadly force if necessary to complete their mission. The posse represented a professional law enforcement effort that was far more capable and dangerous than anything the Hatfields had faced previously, and its activities would soon escalate the conflict to levels of violence that neither side had previously experienced. The period from 1885 to 1887 was characterized by a series of raids, ambushes, and shootouts between Phillips' posse and various members of the Hatfield organization, creating an atmosphere of guerrilla warfare that terrorized the civilian population of the Tug Fork Valley and attracted increasing attention from state and federal authorities. These conflicts were no longer limited to the immediate members of the feuding families, but involved hired gunmen, bounty hunters, and law enforcement officers who had their own reasons for participating in the violence. The escalating nature of the conflict was demonstrated by several incidents during this period that showed both sides' increasing willingness to use deadly force and their decreasing concern for the safety of non-combatants who might be caught in the crossfire. The feud was evolving from a family dispute into something approaching a small-scale civil war that threatened to destroy the entire social fabric of the Tug Fork Valley. By late 1887, it had become clear to Devil Anse Hatfield that his family's position was becoming increasingly precarious, as the combination of legal pressure from Kentucky authorities and military-style raids by Phillips' posse was gradually wearing down his organization's ability to resist. The Hatfields were facing enemies who had superior resources, legal authority, and professional military experience, and the traditional advantages of local knowledge and family loyalty were proving insufficient to guarantee their survival. It was in this context of growing desperation and declining prospects that de Valence made the decision that would ultimately seal his family's fate and would create the most infamous incident in the entire history of the Hatfield-McCoy feud. Rather than continuing to fight a defensive campaign against superior forces, he decided to launch a decisive offensive strike that would eliminate the McCoy family's leadership and end their ability to continue the conflict. The plan that de Valence developed represented both strategic thinking and a fundamental miscalculation about the political consequences of the action he was contemplating. By attacking the McCoy family directly, he hoped to achieve the kind of decisive victory that would force his enemies to abandon their pursuit of revenge and would restore his family's position as the unchallenged power in the region. However, the attack that de Valence was planning would prove to be a strategic disaster that would destroy his family's reputation, unite public opinion against them, and provide their enemies with the political ammunition necessary to achieve their ultimate destruction. The New Year's Night Massacre of 1888 would mark the beginning of the end for the Hatfield organization and would transform de Valence from a respected regional leader into a national symbol of frontier, lawlessness, and brutality. Act 3. The Price of a Feud. The New Year's Night Massacre of January 1, 1888, represented the climactic moment of the Hatfield-McCoy feud and the beginning of its end. What de Valence Hatfield conceived as a decisive strike to end the conflict once and for all instead became the act that would destroy his family's reputation and unite the entire nation against them. The planning for the attack began in December 1887, when de Valence concluded that his family's position had become untenable under the constant pressure from Kentucky authorities and Frank Phillips' bounty hunters. His son Cap Hatfield and his uncle Jim Vance, two of the most violent and uncompromising members of the Hatfield organization, had been urging him to take decisive action against the McCoy family, arguing that half measures and defensive tactics had only emboldened their enemies and attracted more outside intervention. The strategy that emerged from these discussions was brutal in its simplicity. The Hatfield organization would launch a surprise attack on Randolph McCoy's homestead, killing the McCoy patriarch and as many of his family members as possible, thereby eliminating the leadership of their enemies and demonstrating to anyone else who might consider challenging them that the consequences would be swift and fatal. The plan represented a fundamental escalation in the nature of the conflict, as it called for the deliberate targeting of noncombatants, including women and children, who had not been directly involved in the violence that had characterized the feud thus far. This departure from the informal rules of engagement that had previously limited the conflict to adult males reflected both the desperation of the Hatfield position and the influence of the most radical members of their organization. On the night of January 1, 1888, a force of 8 to 12 Hatfield gunmen, led by Cap Hatfield and Jim Vance, surrounded Randolph McCoy's cabin in a remote area of Pike County, Kentucky. The timing of the attack was carefully chosen to maximize the psychological impact, as New Year's Day was traditionally a time of celebration and family gathering when people would be least prepared for violence. The cabin that served as the McCoy family's home was a typical frontier dwelling, constructed of logs and designed more for practicality than defense. It provided minimal protection against determined attackers and could easily be destroyed by fire if the occupants refused to surrender. The isolation of the location meant that the family could expect no help from neighbors or authorities, making them completely dependent on their own resources for survival. The attack began at approximately 1 a.m., when the Hatfield gunmen opened fire on the cabin without warning, shooting through the windows and doors in an attempt to kill or disable the occupants before they could organize any defense. The initial volley was followed by sustained firing that continued for several minutes, creating a terrifying cacophony that shattered the winter silence and announced to the McCoy family that their enemies had come to finish the feud once and for all. The McCoy family's response to the attack was hampered by the surprise nature of the assault and by their limited access to weapons and ammunition. However, they were not completely helpless, and several family members, including Randolph McCoy himself, managed to return fire from positions inside the cabin, creating a firefight that lasted for more than an hour and that resulted in casualties on both sides. The most tragic aspect of the attack was the deliberate targeting of non-combatants who posed no threat to the attackers and who were present only because they happened to be members of the McCoy family. Calvin McCoy, one of Randolph's younger sons, was shot and killed while trying to defend his family's home. Olifair McCoy, Randolph's daughter, was also shot and killed, becoming one of the few women to die directly as a result of the Feud violence. Sarah McCoy, Randolph's wife and the mother of the slain children, was brutally beaten by the attackers after the cabin was overrun, suffering injuries that would leave her permanently disabled and that would serve as a constant reminder of the night when her family was destroyed. The beating of an elderly woman represented a violation of the codes of honor that were supposed to govern even the most violent conflicts, and it demonstrated the extent to which the feud had corrupted the moral standards of its participants. The most dramatic moment of the attack occurred when the Hatfield gunmen set fire to the cabin in an attempt to force the surviving McCoys to surrender or to die in the flames. The use of fire as a weapon represented another escalation in the brutality of the conflict, as it threatened to kill not just the intended targets but anyone else who might be trapped inside the building. Randolph McCoy himself managed to escape from the burning cabin and flee into the surrounding forest, where he evaded his pursuers and survived to tell the story of the attack. His escape was both a personal victory and a strategic failure for the Hatfields, as it meant that the primary target of their assault had survived and would be able to provide testimony about what had happened during the attack. The survival of Randolph McCoy also meant that the Hatfield attack had failed in its primary objective of eliminating the McCoy family's leadership and ending their ability to continue the feud. Instead of achieving a decisive victory, the attackers had created new martyrs for their enemy's cause and had provided them with evidence of Hatfield brutality that could be used to justify whatever retaliation might follow. The immediate aftermath of the New Year's Night Massacre was a scene of devastation that shocked even those who were accustomed to the violence that had characterized the Tug Fork Valley for the previous decade. The McCoy cabin was reduced to smoldering ruins, 2 family members were dead, others were severely injured, and the survivors were left homeless and traumatized by what they had experienced. However, the long-term consequences of the attack would prove to be even more devastating for the Hatfield family than the immediate results had been for their victims. News of the massacre spread rapidly throughout Kentucky and beyond, carried by newspapers that were eager to report on what they portrayed as a shocking example of frontier brutality and lawlessness. The newspaper coverage of the New Year's Night Massacre transformed the Hatfield-McCoy feud from a regional news story into a national sensation that captured the attention of readers throughout the United States and even in Europe. The attack on a family in their home, particularly the killing of a young woman and the beating of an elderly woman, violated standards of civilized behavior that were widely accepted even on the frontier, creating a wave of public revulsion that would have profound political consequences. The political impact of the massacre was immediate and decisive. Kentucky Governor Simon Bolivar Buckner, who had been under pressure to take more aggressive action against the Hatfields, now had the justification he needed to authorize whatever measures might be necessary to bring the perpetrators to justice. The governor issued new proclamations offering increased rewards for the capture of the Hatfield leaders and authorizing the use of state militia forces if necessary to enforce Kentucky law. More importantly, the massacre had united public opinion against the Hatfields in ways that would make it politically impossible for West Virginia authorities to continue protecting them from Kentucky justice. The attack had been so brutal and so clearly unjustified that even the Hatfields' traditional allies began to distance themselves from the family and to call for legal action against those responsible for the killings. Frank Phillips, the bounty hunter who had been pursuing the Hatfields for several years, now found himself with greatly enhanced authority and resources to continue his campaign against the family. The Kentucky government authorized him to recruit additional men and to pursue the Hatfields with whatever force might be necessary to achieve their capture, essentially giving him a blank check to wage war against the entire Hatfield organization. The response to the New Year's Night Massacre marked the beginning of the final phase of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a period during which the conflict would be transformed from a family dispute into a law enforcement operation with the full backing of state government authority. The Hatfields would no longer be fighting against a rival family with limited resources, but against professional law enforcement officers with legal authority and superior equipment. The manhunt that followed the massacre was relentless and methodical, utilizing modern investigative techniques and communication technologies that gave the pursuers significant advantages over their targets. Phillips and his men were able to coordinate their activities across state lines, to gather intelligence from informants and sympathizers, and to maintain pressure on the Hatfield organization that made it increasingly difficult for them to operate effectively. The first major success of the enhanced manhunt came on January 19, 1888, when Phillips and his posse cornered a group of Hatfield supporters in the Battle of Grapevine Creek, a firefight that resulted in the capture of several key members of the organization and the death of others who resisted arrest. The battle demonstrated that the Hatfields were no longer able to operate with impunity in their traditional strongholds and that their enemies now had the resources and determination to pursue them wherever they might try to hide. The most significant casualty of the post-massacre campaign was Jim Vance, Devil Anse's uncle and one of the most feared members of the Hatfield organization. Vance was killed in a shootout with Phillips' men in January 1888. Eliminating one of the most violent and uncompromising leaders of the family and demonstrating that even the most experienced and dangerous members of the organization were vulnerable to the enhanced law enforcement efforts. The death of Jim Vance was both practically and symbolically important for the ultimate resolution of the feud. Vance had been one of the primary advocates for violent solutions to the family's problems, and his elimination removed a voice that had consistently argued against any kind of peaceful settlement or compromise with their enemies. His death also demonstrated to other members of the organization that the risks of continuing the violent conflict had increased dramatically. The capture of other key members of the Hatfield organization continued throughout 1888 and 1889. As Phillips and his men systematically hunted down and arrested the men who had participated in the New Year's Night Massacre and other violent incidents during the feud. The arrested men were transported to Kentucky to stand trial for murder, kidnapping, and other serious crimes that carried the possibility of death sentences. The trials of the captured Hatfield supporters became major news events that attracted attention from throughout the United States and that provided the public with detailed accounts of the violence that had characterized the feud. The testimony presented during these trials revealed the extent of the brutality that had been committed by both sides, but it also demonstrated that the Hatfields had been responsible for the most serious violations of law and civilized behavior. The legal proceedings that followed the arrests were conducted according to standard judicial procedures, providing the defendants with legal representation and the right to present evidence in their own defense. However, the political atmosphere surrounding the trials made it virtually impossible for the defendants to receive fair hearings, as public opinion had been so thoroughly turned against them by the publicity surrounding the New Year's Night Massacre. The most significant of these trials was that of Ellison Cottontop Mounts, an illegitimate son of the murdered Ellison Hatfield, who was believed to have been one of the most active participants in the massacre. Mounts was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, becoming the only person to be executed as a direct result of the Hatfield-McCoy feud violence. The execution of Cottontop Mounts on February 18, 1890, marked the symbolic end of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, as it represented the ultimate triumph of legal justice over the personal vengeance that had driven the conflict for more than a decade. The hanging was conducted according to legal procedures and with appropriate solemnity, providing a stark contrast to the vigilante executions that had characterized the feud violence. Other members of the Hatfield organization received prison sentences ranging from several years to life imprisonment, effectively destroying the family's ability to continue organized resistance against their enemies. The sentences also served as a warning to other potential participants in family feuds that the state government was prepared to use its full authority to punish those who chose violence over legal remedies for their grievances. The interstate legal battle that accompanied the arrests and trials of the Hatfield supporters created precedents that would influence American law enforcement for decades to come. The dispute between Kentucky and West Virginia over the extradition of the arrested men eventually reached the United States Supreme Court, which ruled in the case of Mahone versus Justice that Kentucky had the right to try men who had been illegally kidnapped from West Virginia as long as they had committed crimes within Kentucky jurisdiction. The Supreme Court decision established important principles about interstate law enforcement cooperation and the limits of state sovereignty that would be applied in many subsequent cases involving cross-border criminal activity. The ruling also demonstrated that even the most local and personal conflicts could have national implications when they involved violations of federal law or interstate relations. The destruction of the Hatfield organization as an effective fighting force marked the end of the violent phase of the feud, but it did not immediately resolve all of the underlying issues that had created the conflict. Both families continued to harbor resentments about the deaths of their family members and the destruction of their property, and the possibility of renewed violence remained a concern for law enforcement authorities for several years after the formal end of the feud. However, the changed political and legal environment of the 1890s made it increasingly difficult for family feuds to develop the kind of organized violence that had characterized the Hatfield-McCoy conflict. The expansion of federal law enforcement authority, the improvement of communications and transportation systems, and the increasing integration of remote areas into the national economy all worked to prevent the isolation and lawlessness that had made the feud possible. The personal cost of the feud for both families was enormous, extending far beyond the immediate casualties to include the psychological trauma, economic disruption, and social stigma that would affect the survivors for the rest of their lives. The Hatfield family lost not only several members to death and imprisonment, but also their position as leaders of their community and their reputation for honor and respectability. Devalance Hatfield himself survived the feud physically unharmed, but he was a broken man who had lost his political influence, his business empire, and most importantly, his sons and other family members who had been killed or imprisoned as a result of his decisions. He spent his final years as a marginal figure who was remembered more for the violence of the feud than for his earlier achievements as a businessman and community leader. The transformation of Devalance from a respected patriarch to a national symbol of frontier lawlessness was completed in his later years when he underwent a religious conversion and was baptized in the Tug Fork River by a local preacher. This public embrace of Christianity was seen by many as an acknowledgement of guilt for the violence of the feud and as an attempt to find forgiveness for the deaths that had resulted from his decisions. Randolph McCoy's fate was equally tragic, though in different ways. Although he had survived the New Year's Night massacre and had seen his enemies brought to justice, he had lost 5 of his children to feud violence and had watched his family's reputation suffer from their association with the conflict. He spent his final years as an embittered old man who was haunted by memories of the violence and who never fully recovered from the trauma of watching his family being destroyed. The economic impact of the feud on both families and on the entire Tug Fork Valley was substantial, as the violence and lawlessness had discouraged investment and development that might have brought prosperity to the region. The negative publicity associated with the feud had created a national image of Appalachia as a backward and violent region that was unsuitable for modern business or tourism, an image that would persist for generations and that would contribute to the economic isolation of the area. The cultural legacy of the Hatfield-McCoy feud proved to be more enduring and more complex than its immediate political and legal consequences. The story of the two families' conflict captured the American imagination in ways that reflected both fascination with frontier violence and anxiety about the social changes that were transforming the nation during the late 19th century. The feud became a symbol of the passing of the frontier era and the triumph of law and civilization over the personal justice and clan loyalty that had characterized earlier periods of American history. The story was retold countless times in newspapers, magazines, books, and eventually in movies and television programs, each retelling adding new elements and interpretations while preserving the basic narrative of family honor, forbidden love, and violent revenge. However, the popular understanding of the Hatfield-McCoy feud often simplified and romanticized what had actually been a complex conflict involving economic competition, political rivalry, and social change as well as personal animosity. The real story of the feud reveals as much about the transformation of American society during the Gilded Age as it does about the specific grievances and personalities that drove the violence. The feud also became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal pride and family loyalty to override legal and moral constraints on behavior. The story demonstrated how quickly disputes over relatively minor issues could escalate into deadly conflicts when they occurred in environments where formal law enforcement was weak and where cultural norms supported violent responses to perceived insults. The lessons of the Hatfield-McCoy feud remained relevant long after the last shots had been fired and the last trials had been completed. The story continued to resonate with Americans who were struggling to balance competing demands for individual freedom and social order, for family loyalty and civic responsibility, and for local autonomy and national unity. The transformation of the feud from a historical event into a permanent part of American folklore ensured that the names of Devil-Anse Hatfield and Randolph McCoy would be remembered long after the specific details of their conflict had been forgotten or distorted. Their story became a metaphor for any bitter dispute between families, organizations, or communities, and the phrase "like the Hatfields and McCoys" entered the American language as a way of describing conflicts that seemed irreconcilable. Today, more than 130 years after the New Year's Night massacre that marked the beginning of the end of the feud, the story of the Hatfields and McCoys continues to fascinate new generations of Americans who are trying to understand the complex relationships between individual freedom and social responsibility, between loyalty to family and loyalty to law, and between the desire for justice and the need for peace. The descendants of both families have long since made peace with each other, and many have worked together to preserve the historical record of the feud and to ensure that its lessons are not forgotten. The Tug Fork Valley has been transformed by modern transportation, communication, and economic development into a region that bears little resemblance to the isolated and lawless area where the feud took place. However, the fundamental questions raised by the Hatfield-McCoy conflict remain as relevant today as they were in the 1880s. How should communities balance the demands of justice and mercy? When is violence justified as a response to injustice? How can societies prevent personal grievances from escalating into broader conflicts that destroy innocent lives and damage entire communities? The story of the Hatfields and McCoys provides no easy answers to these questions, but it does demonstrate the terrible costs that can result when pride, hatred, and the desire for revenge are allowed to override reason, compassion, and the rule of law. Their feud began with a stolen pig and ended with dozens of deaths, countless injuries, and the destruction of two families that had once been pillars of their communities. The ultimate tragedy of the Hatfield-McCoy feud was not just the violence and death it produced, but the waste of human potential and the destruction of communities that might have prospered if their energy had been directed toward constructive rather than destructive purposes. The talents and resources that both families possessed could have been used to build schools, churches, and businesses that would have benefited entire generations, but instead they were consumed in a cycle of violence that produced nothing but suffering and regret. This was a story that became an American legend, a cautionary tale about pride and revenge that continues to resonate more than a century after the last shots were fired in the mountains of Appalachia. We are curious to know in the comments, where are you watching from, and is there a forgotten piece of your own city's or state's history that you believe deserves to be told? If you believe that the forgotten stories of history deserve a voice, subscribe to Don't Forget About Us and join our mission to ensure these crucial stories are never lost. And don't leave just yet. Please watch our next video, already recommended for you on your screen, about another mystery that history has tried to forget.